let's discuss The Wife of Bath prologue and tale by Geoffrey Chaucer. The source for this presentation is once again Helen Cooper, and full bibliographic information is supplied on the Works Cited page for the second unit. Let's begin by talking about The Wife of Bath prologue. As we noticed when we discussed the general prologue, there's a lot that we don't know for sure about the process that Chaucer used in writing the Canterbury Tales. But as Cooper states, scholars believe that the Wife of Bath prologue was written fairly late. The Wife of Bath is one of the most fully developed three-dimensional characters in the Canterbury Tales. Also, scholars have determined that the tale that she tells was written specifically for her and was probably written fairly late in Chaucer's composing process. Now, we discussed that the general prologue is an example of the estate satire genre. Many of the prologues and tales in Canterbury Tales can be classified in specific genres, but Cooper states that it's very difficult to pin down the genre of the Wife of Bath prologue. It deals with materials from anti-feminist tracts, but it's not a tract. Oh, one thing that I need to tell you is that Cooper and this presentation use the term anti-feminist to mean anti-woman, not anti-women's rights. There was no women's rights movement until the 20th century. So anti-feminist means anti-woman. Okay? Okay. So, as the rise of the middle class resulting from the specialization of work proceeded, so did the rise of publications that were anti-feminist, Cooper tells us. But the sentiments and the wide sources for talking about feminist views stretch all the way back to Genesis. Now, while the topics that the wife discusses are taken from those anti-feminist tracts, the Wife of Bath prologue certainly doesn't fit that genre. It also doesn't fit into the genre of confession, although that's what it most closely resembles. True, the wife admits to actions that anti-feminists and even the church would find inappropriate or even sinful. But remember that confession includes remorse and an intent to change. But as Cooper points out, the wife sees absolutely nothing wrong in her behavior. In fact, the entire prologue defends her behavior. She certainly doesn't indicate any intention to change. As a matter of fact, she says she's looking for a sixth husband, and if he dies, she'll look for a seventh. She doesn't have any plans to change, so it's not really a confession either. Now, in The Wife of Bath prologue, the wife deals with circumstances that were very common in many marriages at that time. And she also deals with common beliefs and texts that deal with marriage. But as Cooper states, the wife uses those texts to suit her purposes. And quite often, those purposes are the opposite of what the writers meant to begin with. And as we shall see, by doing so, she takes away the weapons that her husband and others who want to castigate or put her down, might use to attack her way of life. And she does that before they can use them themselves. In fact, not only does she take those weapons away, but she even changes them into weapons that support her rather than attack her. Now, as Cooper says, the Wife of Bath certainly could have been an unsympathetic character. She talks endlessly and tends to ramble, much like I do. And as Cooper says, she's like the worst nightmare that any anti-feminist could possibly have dreamed up. But it seems very clear that Chaucer didn't want the Wife of Bath to be unattractive or unsympathetic. The Wife of Bath has been a strong favorite among the Pilgrims from the time that the Canterbury Tales were published. And Cooper says that the fact that Chaucer was able to make her so irresistibly attractive is one of the marks of his genius. Okay, let's talk about what the wife's goals were in the prologue. As we noted when we discussed the general prologue, the wife is an excellent weaver, but her vocation is that of wife. Men, love, marriage, and sex are her main interests, and as Cooper says, she pursues those interests with all the devotion that the knight brings to chivalry and the parson brings to religion. Now that's knight with a capital K. Remember that there was a pilgrim who is the knight. And the knight that is included in the tales as a pilgrim was the ideal of the men who fight. It's not the same person as the knight who rapes the maiden in the Wife of Bath's tale. It's a completely different person. So the knight in the Wife of Bath's tale is knight with a small k, and the knight who is a pilgrim is the knight with a large K. When we talk about knight in discussing the Wife of Bath, we're talking about the knight with the small k, the knight that is in the Wife of Bath's tale. Just wanted to make sure to clarify that for you. Now, the wife's long discussion about virgins versus married women at the beginning of the prologue is basically an attempt to provide evidence that marrying after being widowed doesn't mean that the wife is a sinner bound for hell, and that the Bible doesn't say that. The book that her fifth husband, Jenkin, mainly uses to belittle the wife was written by St. Jerome, and he based his claim that women should remain virgins on even earlier writings, according to Cooper. The wife doesn't disagree that virginity is better. She uses a comparison to cups. Yes, virgins might be the golden chalices in heaven, but they need wooden cups in heaven too. She's as fine with going to heaven as an average wooden cup as some students are to earn C's in classes. She would rather be married and be average in heaven than to forego love, romance, and sex and be a shining beacon of perfection in heaven. Now, that's a decision that she has made for herself, and she doesn't want to be belittled for making that choice. Not only does the wife want to be married, she wants to be dominant in her marriage. In today's world, that might seem unreasonable. Women now have as much presence and power in the world outside the home as men do. And also, we know now that men and women are equal, and the best way to run a marriage is to share responsibility and communicate openly with each other. But we have to remember that in medieval Europe, women had no presence in the sphere outside of the home, even if she was a skilled craftswoman and ran a business as the Wife of Bath does. Even in the home at that time, it was assumed that men made the rules and women followed them without question or faced being beaten, even publicly beaten. Actually, this was pretty much the rule into even the 1970s. But in medieval Europe, the very concept of women having any voice outside the home was so alien that even a woman as strong as our wife would never have dreamed of it. So if women were to have any control at all, it had to be in the home. But the wife does explain, through her discussion of her marriage to Jenkin, that giving women power in the home doesn't have to be painful for men. As Cooper points out, once Jenkin relinquishes control, the wife is as kind and loving to him as any woman could possibly be to a man. Now, it's very important that the wife in no way says other people should think like she does or live like she does. She's not telling anyone what to do. She just doesn't want to be belittled for thinking what she thinks and living like she lives. She's perfectly willing to explain what she believes and why she believes it, and that's pretty much what the prologue does. But she isn't trying to talk anybody into agreeing with her necessarily. Apparently, all the wife really wants is some control and say in her own life. Now, that seems like a really little thing to us, something that everybody should have. But for women to ask for control of anything, even their own bodies, in medieval Europe was outrageous and pretty much unheard of. It wasn't until 200 years later that everyone in the Catholic Church agreed that we even had souls. Remember the faceless, nameless wives in the Epic of Gilgamesh? That's pretty much what most women still were, and were still expected to be. Women weren't people with rights then. They were possessions. First they were possessions of their fathers, then of their husbands, then if their husbands died, of other male relatives. The wife of Bath doesn't want to be a possession. She wants some control of her own life, and that was a revolutionary idea in Chaucer's time. Okay, but let's look at what we have here. We have a woman who wants to get married again. She tells us that. But she's openly admitting that she wants to be dominant in marriage. She is, as Cooper says, every anti-feminist nightmare who eats men whole. Now, obviously, the wife can't be honest about who she is and what she wants at home, because that's where she's looking for a husband, and no one would marry her if they knew these things about her. But on the road, with the pilgrims, she can open up, and no one at home will ever know about it. The Wife of Bath prologue and tale could not exist if the wife hadn't gone on a pilgrimage. The travel aspect of the tales is absolutely necessary. And we'll see the same thing in the partner's prologue and tale as we would in most of the tales if we read the entire work. Okay, now we know what she wants to do. Let's take a look at how she does it. As Cooper points out, throughout the prologue, and especially in the opening section in which the wife talks about whether it's a sin to marry several times, the wife cites sections of the Bible and also anti-feminist writings and tracts to explain why what she does is okay. Now, it's important to notice that the people who would damn her for her multiple marriages would use exactly those same sources. It's awfully difficult to use a source to justify your views when the opposition has used the same source to justify theirs. So what the wife does is she takes the weapons out of her opponent's hands by interpreting the writings differently, by selecting different passages to focus on, or by finding loopholes in what's written. Now, obviously, as we noticed as we read this, that the Bible is a major source. The Bible says that adultery, which is having sex with more than one person in your life in the medieval view, is a sin. The wife says, okay, she acknowledges that. The Bible does say that. But she also points out that Abraham, Jacob, and Solomon had more than one wife in the Old Testament, and the Sumerian wife had more than one husband in the New Testament. And God in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament didn't say any of those people were going to hell. Okay, she says, St. Jerome says we should all be virgins forever, but the Bible says be fruitful and multiply, so how is that possible? Yes, she admits the apostle, would have been the Apostle Paul, who is believed to have written over half the New Testament, was a lifelong virgin. But that's perfection! That's the golden chalice in heaven, the shining, bejeweled example of what perfection is. But being average in heaven can't be that bad. It's heaven. How bad can it be? So the wife says that for herself, and just for herself, she would rather have love, romance, marriage, and sex on earth and be average in heaven. The wife, now, in this presentation, the wife has already agreed with the points that the opposition would make, but she's looked at different parts of the sources they respect to prove the opposite of what they would say. She's admitted that yes, it might be better to be a virgin, but not everybody has to be perfect. That's not what Christ says is necessary for redemption. Now, it's true that other pilgrims do find ways to dispute her, and we even see a hint of that when the partner interrupts, and we definitely would see it if we read all the tales. But it's not easy to find ways to refute her because she's already laid out the opposition's argument and refuted it using the same sources that the opposition would use. Of course, the anti-feminists in St. Jerome didn't mean to leave a loophole that you could go to heaven and be average. They didn't mean that. So what she's actually doing is she's twisting their words around and manipulating the sources in order to justify a way of life that they are actually preaching against. Do the stories of Solomon and the Sumerian wife mean she can have 5 or 6 husbands, she asks, or should it only be 2 or 3? Well, the wife says that's not clear. But what is clear is be fruitful and multiply. She says anyone can read and understand that. And since she's certain about that statement, she's going to follow it instead of living by stories that aren't as clear to her. Now, of course, the church wouldn't agree with any of this, but it would be difficult to argue against her, and that's what she wants. Now, just as the wife takes the weapons out of her philosophical opponent's hands, she also grabs them from her first 3 husbands before they can even open their mouths. She tells us flat out that she married her first 3 husbands because they were rich. He says that they could barely meet the challenge of making love to her because they're so old, and she always found that kind of funny. But when these men come home at night, before they can open their mouths to accuse her of being greedy or, more importantly, of cheating on them, she argues with them as if they've already made those statements. She says that they don't buy her enough. So they can't very well argue that she's extravagant in spending their money. They say that she argues that they complain about her. So they really can't say that she runs them down in public. She talks about how men find fault with women, with their wives, no matter whether the women are rich or poor or ugly or beautiful or faithful or unfaithful. There's simply no way of pleasing them. With no kind of woman makes husbands happy. And we're going to see a very similar discussion between Iago and Desdemona in Othello. Then she starts implying that they're cheating on her. Okay? Because if you accuse somebody of something that they're going to accuse you of, it makes it that much harder for them to accuse you. So she says if they're going to accuse her of cheating just because she visits her friend Jenkyn, then that must be because they know that they're cheating when they visit the neighbor's wife, who's young and beautiful just as Jenkyn is younger. And, she says it doesn't even really matter if somebody has told her husbands that she's cheating, because that doesn't necessarily mean it's true just because somebody says it. It's all wrong, she says. It's just all untrue, and it's horribly unfair of them to accuse her of spending too much money or complaining about them, or worst of all, cheating. Now, remember, they haven't accused her of any of this. Okay? And she says they're just mean for saying it. Like I said, she hasn't said anything. So before these old men could even open their mouths, she's made them feel guilty and remorseful. Of course, that doesn't mean she isn't having an affair, or at least lustful and loving feelings towards other men, like Jenkins, for example. But she shuts up her husbands before they can even speak, just like she shuts up her philosophical opponents before they can. It's a very manipulative way to communicate. She knows it, and she's good at it. Now, after she marries Jenkyn, she has to take another route, because he's not old. He won't stop preaching about how wicked women are from his book of St. Jerome. She gets so sick of hearing it that she rips the book And then Jenkins, of course, gets really mad at her and hits her really hard, hard enough to break an eardrum. And even though she's hurt and angry, she's lying there and she sees an advantage. She lets him go ahead and think that he's killed her, or at least hurt her really badly. And he's filled with so much remorse and guilt that he goes ahead and turns over dominance in the marriage to the wife, which is what she's wanted all along. But the wife points out to us that turning over dominance didn't result in any kind of pain or unhappiness for Jenkins, quite the opposite. Once he gives her control, she makes him as happy as any man could be. She's as good to him as any woman could possibly be. Okay, let's take just a couple of minutes and look at the wife of Bath's tale. Now, as Cooper states, the wife's tale combines the genres of romance and folk tale or fairy tale. The Arthurian legend, which the tale is based on, was and is one of the major romances in British literature. And of course, the fairies that are associated with the old woman are an element of fairy tale. But while those are the literary genres of the tale, its function is that of an exemplar. Now, as Cooper states, an exemplar is a story that ministers include in sermons to provide examples of the topic of the sermon. The Wife's Tale provides an example of the main points in the Wife of Bath prologue. The old woman tells the knight that what women want most is dominance in marriage, which, as we've seen, is like the major point of the Wife of Bath prologue. Also, at the end of the tale, the old woman turns into a wife who is both young and beautiful and will be faithful. Now, recall that she gives the knight the option to choose between a young and beautiful wife who is likely to cheat because everybody will want her, and the old woman as a wife, that she actually is, who will be faithful to him because, well, even if he doesn't believe it otherwise, who else would want her? It's only because he lets her choose that she awards him with both of those traits in a wife. That action exemplifies what the wife says in the prologue about her treatment of Jenkins. In the prologue, she states that after Jenkins gives her dominance in the marriage, she's as good to him as any wife could be to a husband. The conclusion that we're encouraged to draw from the way she treats Jenkins and from the way that the wife, the old woman in the tale, treats the knight, is that if men allow women dominance in marriage, the men will be rewarded with excellent treatment and, presumably, a happy marriage and home life. But in addition to being an exemplar, sorry about that, the Wife of Bath tale adds an interesting and an important discussion. The knight is really reluctant to have sex with the old woman after they marry because she's old and ugly, and also she's poor and not of the noble class. The old woman replies to his remarks with a discussion of what nobility means. And your book does explain in a footnote that when she talks about gentility or gentilis, she's actually talking about nobility. They're used interchangeably in Chaucer. So, the wife says, okay, you were born as a member of the class of nobles. So you are a nobleman. She wasn't born in that same class. She was born as a serf. But they had agreed when they first met that if she saved his life, the knight would do whatever the old woman asked. And she kept her end of the deal, as she points out, and saved his life by telling him what women want. Now, here he is, alive, thanks to her, and he isn't keeping his end of the deal by being a husband to her. Now, if being noble is part of a person's bloodline, which is what the word used to mean back then, he would go ahead and do his duty and honor his commitment. But since she honored her commitment and he didn't, it doesn't look like nobility has anything to do with bloodline or wealth. Again, she cites sources to confirm that nobility depends on action, not birth. And she proves that she is the one who is noble, not him. Now, this discussion of how nobility should be defined is one that the Pilgrims debate throughout all of the prologues and tales, as is the debate on what women want and what the nature of marriage is and should be. So in this one tale and prologue, the wife addresses three of the major themes that are debated among the Pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. Okay, that about wraps it up on the Wife of Bath. If you have any questions, do email me from an account other than Canvas, as we know, at deborah.oakey@csn.edu. I hope that this little presentation helped point out some things about the Wife of Bath prologue and tale that you might not have noticed before, or at least clarified and explained them for you. And I also hope that you kind of enjoyed it at least a little bit. We'll be getting back together pretty soon to talk about the Partners, tale and prologue, or prologue and tale to put it in the right order. In the meantime, you have just an absolutely terrific day. I hope you have some time to enjoy yourself today. Talk to you soon.